Hello students, in this video we will discuss the concepts of imperialism and colonialism. Throughout history, we may note that civilizations have progressed at different rates. Some have been rich while others poor. Some have advanced military equipments while others are still primitive. Clashes between nations were often unbalanced. More advanced people had significant advantages of superior weaponry and fighting strategies. Relatively sophisticated nations have taken up land and resources from their more primitive counterparts and even enslaved their people. When a strong nation attempts to expand its territory by military conquest, political and economic domination, or colonization, it is practicing imperialism. The word imperial is derived from the Latin term meaning empire. The history of imperialism can be divided into three major phases. Since the 12th century BC, history reports ancient civilizations building great empires by conquering weaker nations. By the end of Middle Ages, European countries were entering into a new phase of exploration, and colonialism developed as a modern form of imperialism. The Industrial Revolution brought a third phase of imperialism. Some argue that this ended in the later part of 20th century, while others believe imperialism still continues to be present but disguised as economic influence. Why would a nation practice imperialism or colonization? It is for economic benefits. Amassing large territories allowed them to expand their wealth and control trade. New territories provided new markets for goods, fresh sources and raw materials, investment opportunities, and products that could be exported to other countries. Earliest known imperialists were Phoenicians. They ruled the region that makes up Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. They were great sailors, navigators, and traders. They built beautiful buildings in their wondrous cities. The Phoenicians stood at the height of power and prosperity. They were among the first to send out explorers and establish trading colonies throughout the Mediterranean Sea. Phoenician colonies existed along the southern coast of Spain, northern coast of Africa, and western coast of Sicily. Through colonization, they built trading monopoly that lasted nearly 300 years. The desire to expand and control trade motivated the Phoenicians to seek and conquer other lands. Other nations were also motivated by Phoenician success. Eventually, Assyria won control of the Mediterranean trade from the Phoenicians. Rome was the greatest colonial power of ancient times. It began expanding overseas in 264 BC. At its height, the Romans ruled over much of Europe and Middle East. The great Roman Empire ultimately collapsed in the 5th century AD under a burden of governmental corruption, heavy taxes, and wars. Several hundred years later, German nobles attempted to revive the Roman Empire in Central Europe. It was known as Holy Roman Empire. This was a period of great advancement in Europe's economic, political, and religious fronts. European Christians, encouraged by the church, sponsored the Crusades. These early military expeditions took place between 11th and 13th centuries AD. At that time, Muslims had taken control of the Holy Land, or what is now Israel, Syria, and Palestine. This area is Holy Land for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. European Christians formed armies and joined with knights to travel to the Middle East to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. Though religion was the primary focus of these missions, financial gains were also made. Many people joined the fight in for adventure, securing wealth and new lands. The Crusaders provided opportunity for Italian merchants to explore new markets relatively closer to home. Europeans became acquainted with different cultures in the East, acquired new taste in food and clothing. These experiences increased their desire to travel, and such explorations or voyages prepared Europeans for the next phase of imperialism. The second phase of imperialism began in the 15th century. It is often referred to as a period of European colonization, exploration, and colonialism. Muslims still controlled trade routes across the Middle East between Asia and Europe, but Portugal and Spain were looking to expand their markets. In the year 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama established a new trade route around Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. His search led to Portuguese trading colonies in West Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Other European explorers, such as Christopher Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, and Vincente Pinzon, made expeditions to the New World. By the 16th century, major European powers competed through an economic system called mercantilism. This policy was propelled by the belief that a nation's wealth is determined by the amount of silver and gold it possesses. Silver and gold were also accumulated by selling goods to foreign countries. Colonizing other lands allowed nations to acquire more goods and resources to sell. The more colonies a nation had, the more wealth it could amass. So, all the countries started to acquire more and more colonies. Spanish armies conquered Aztec and Inca empires in Mexico and Central America. The Spanish governments awarded its citizens plots of land in the new colonies so that they would inhabit the territory, control its natives, and regulate labor. The plan was to integrate the natives and form profitable satellite colony. It would be called New Spain. As a result, Spain emerged as one of the most powerful empires of this time. Portugal concentrated on Southern America, while Britain and France looked to North America. European powers often established trading laws in their American colonies to fit their own trading needs. In North America, for example, the British government passed a series of navigation laws during 1600s to strengthen its control over the economy of its 13 colonies. These laws required British colonists to trade exclusively with British merchants and to use British ships. Other laws limited colonial manufacturing because the British wanted the colonies to depend largely on Great Britain for manufactured goods. Slavery was also an important part of economic policy. Slaves imported from Africa were forced to work on plantations that produced cotton and other raw materials for mother country. However, these new territories eventually became less profitable than the European empires had planned. Mother nations depended upon settlers. They thought they would be loyal, but many of the settlers in North America were not motivated by the same economies. Most were after personal freedom and new opportunity. They wanted a place to live and where they could practice their religion freely from the rigid Church of England. Others wanted a chance to own land and prosper. The trade constraints of the British monarchy began to wear on the colonies. Settlers in Latin American colonies were experiencing similar frustrations. Settlers were far removed from their motherlands, which made it easy to disobey them. After several generations, many European settlers had become so integrated in the culture of their new territories, they thought of themselves as citizens of the new land rather than their own home country. Revolutions sent many of the great colonial powers packing. So many colonies got freedom as a result of these revolutions that took place. European colonialism declined considerably in the Americas in the 1800s. These once great colonial powers now focus their attention eastward. Already, Spain and Portugal had established trade routes. Great European nations had established trade with colonies in India, Southeast Asia, starting in the 17th century. The French, British, Dutch chartered trading companies in the name of East India Company had started booming. Under these charters, merchant voyagers were given the authority to acquire territory and exercise governmental functions here. They made laws, established trading posts and currency, and even administered justice and waged wars when the natives rebelled. The manipulation of these underdeveloped territories proved very profitable. They provided a lot of raw materials for the drastic increase in production, which resulted in the third phase of imperialism. The Industrial Revolution modernized trade in the West and imperialism changed it. By the late 1800s, capitalism or free market economies had been established in Europe. The modernization of factories increased the need for new raw materials. Industrial nations also needed raw materials for markets for their manufactured goods and places to invest their cash. This time, the imperialist Europe turned their sights to the African continent. Between late 1800 and early 1900, Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, and Spain divided almost all of Africa among themselves. It was called Scramble for Africa. Britain took control of India at that time. French staked claims to Indochina. Dutch expanded control to East Indies. By 1900, nearly 90% of Africa, Polynesia, Southeast Asia were colonized. US also gained territory and expanded its territory by nearly 4 times. By the 20th century, the competition for economic prosperity and national enthusiasm brought into the world some major conflicts. The two world wars that were waged within a period of 25 years resulted in massive destruction. Europe was devastated. After World War II, colonialism rapidly declined throughout the world. Over time, the idea of subjugating a people or taking their land away has become less acceptable to society. The people living under control of these colonial powers waged protest and increased their demands for the right to self govern. They shared a common language, race, religion, politics, and history. These experiences formed a sense of nationalism which encouraged each colony to seek independence. The United Nations formed a worldwide alliance to preserve peace after the war. The members heard from struggling colonies. UN formed committees to encourage colonial powers to release control of their colonies and assist them in regaining economic and political independence. This chain of events helped to scale down traditional colonialism during 1950s and 60s. Some of the transitional activities became violent, but colonial rule was basically eradicated by the end of 20th century. When colonialism declined, nations were able to evaluate its effects. Poorly uh, the colonized poor people, when they studied the result of colonialism, they found that problems outweighed benefits. Though some of the colonies experienced security stability with the protection of a powerful colonial defense, the people encountered racism, exploitation, and destruction of their traditions and culture. Most colonial rulers forced their way of life on native people. They generally considered the native cultures to be inferior to their own. Many rulers tried to convert the colonial people to their own religion. They also integrated the language of their homelands into those of the natives. Some culture and traditions were permanently altered during colonial domination. For example, in Burma, before colonial period, 90% of the population practiced Buddhism. Under British rule, Buddhist monks who had been the bearers of national value and customs were replaced by Christian missionaries. The Burmese society disintegrated from the influence of another religion. Loss of land and resources made the farmer way of life impossible for a colony once they achieved independence. The economies of colonized nations were structured to be permanently dependent on Western nations. Colonies continue to export their products to former colonial powers, and colonies frequently required foreign aid to stabilize their economies. Colonialism also brought in some diseases which were unheard of before and wiped out the entire population of some of the colonies. So, uh, colonialism led to nationalist feelings and rebellion among colonial people, but it brought great amount of wealth and power to the colonizing nations. Therefore, we have now seen the history of imperialism and colonialism. The three stages of imperialism, which we have seen already, can be summarized as follows. In imperialism phase 1, the earliest known imperialists were Phoenicians. Rome was the greatest colonial empire of ancient times. European Christians, encouraged by church sponsored crusades, these military expeditions took place between 11th and 13th century AD. Imperialism phase 2. This phase is often referred to as the period of European exploration and colonialism. Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama established a new trade route around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. Colonialism in the New World was somewhat different from imperialism of the Eastern Hemisphere. Explorers found sparsely populated land or primitive cultures that were easily exploited. Major European powers competed with each other through an economic system called mercantilism. Spanish armies conquered Aztec and Inca empires in Mexico and Central America. Imperialism phase 3. Industrial Revolution modernized trade in the West. The modernization of factories increased the need for raw materials. Imperialist Europe turned their sight to African continent and divided it among themselves. This is known as scramble for Africa. Thank you.